that if you want to, with the liaisons from the Planning Commission, and I guess it would be myself and Mr. Delshad, since Councilmember Vice Mayor Webb is recused on this, so that we can make sure we're going in the right direction. Yes, Barry.
Linda, one question. I would imagine, of the 9 units, how many of those units are character contributing?
Well, the nine buildings that we're talking about, the co-op conversions, we haven't made, the city has not made any character contributing determination yet. So
Okay. If you had to just give me a number, because, well, where I'm going on that is that any character contributing building would satisfy, I'm certain, that threshold, because that
I think
threshold
that's
is
part of
lowered
what we
anyways.
want them to report to us.
Okay.
That will be one of the criteria under which they will be
Okay, so
reported.
if you can report that back, because right off the top, we might be able to take those buildings, throw them out of the challenge here, and grandfather those. And then maybe the next criteria would be those buildings that are not character contributing, but have done, substantial upgrades, we could then deal with those, and then it should make our job very easy.
Okay, do you think we could get this back by the 17th? Come on, it's 9 buildings. I'll help.
well, the one thing that I'm just concerned about that is just that as you've talked about modifying character contributing, that was a little while ago tonight, but I believe it was to add the interior of the building. So we may actually need to get inside some of the buildings to make that determination.
Well, it's like this. If they're not character contributing from the outside, in this particular case, because we're granting an exception, we certainly could say that the outside has to be character contributing in this case, can't we?
Sure.
And that's,
Because this is an exception no matter what.
Yes, I suppose you could. I'm struggling personally with
All of it.
Why should you be the exception?
I'm struggling with a number of issues, but one is what we're trying to accomplish for the grandfathering. If ultimately it is the planning commission, if the ordinance is adopted as proposed, would allow the planning commission to make a determination the building is character contributing, and then that building would be permitted to convert from condominium, from stock cooperative to condominium, then are we simply trying to speed that process by adopting this what we're still calling a grandfathering provision?
Well, let me ask you a question. Is the reason why these 9 buildings are at issue is because their units by themselves would exceed the cap in certain areas if they were all brought in at the same time?
well, I would imagine the issue is that some of them may not qualify for character contributing buildings. Some of them may not meet even some of our minimal standards of parking, i.e. if you're character contributing, it's 1 parking space per unit, and I'd have to go back and evaluate those to make sure of that. So they may not meet that for a variety of reasons. I don't think it would be the camp issue, because as I mentioned before, it's 126 plus 42 for these conversions. 126 for character contributing, 42 for non. It could be. I mean, the non-character contributing, they may not be able to all happen in 1 year. That part could be true. But then if they're non-character contributing, I can tell you, if they're non-character contributing, I don't think any of these meet today's zoning requirements. So if you're non-character contributing, I think to convert would be very, very difficult, slim to none.
But it is the bottom line, oh, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say, is the bottom line goal here to maintain or present a property that will be in good standing for the next 50 years or 30 or 40 or 50 years, that has been upgraded and that has been robustly renovated, because I'm afraid of maintaining an old dog that should be
I agree.
put to sleep.
If they had all been upgraded, we wouldn't even be having this conversation.
Well, that's correct. So if we can segregate those, then it really probably isn't a very difficult decision on the
I mean, we're
council's
looking
part.
for a way to have the discretion to have someone look at these buildings individually before we say yes. I mean, why does it have to be all or nothing at all?
Well, it does not have to be all or
Okay, what's the
nothing at all.
easiest way for us to have some kind of discretionary review of these 9 buildings to get them approved with the intent that we've all expressed to you all tonight?
I'm not sure, you're looking at me for that answer.
Well, I rely on you
guess
for
I
these
can-
things.
I guess I can tell you that, listening to the council discussion at 11:10 this evening, I don't think that I can give you what, in my opinion, would be the best answer to that question off the top of my head without sitting down with staff. And I have a feeling staff might say the same thing as I'm saying, which is, given what the council direction is, it's not something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. We're just hearing this now. I would think that if we're going to try and accomplish that goal, we would need to sit down and really think about how to do that. We can possibly come up with an answer tonight. I'm not sure to be the best way to accomplish the objective.
May I
Okay.
make a suggestion?
Sure.
Maybe we set at least the minimum requirement that they must have, the minimum that we can come to an agreement, and that you go back to staff and come back and say from these 9, these 7 meet that minimum, these 2 don't, and so forth. So at least we have some idea how many there are, and if the 2 don't agree with it, they have to just stay the way they are, or they're gonna have to, come back.
I think we have to allow staff the time to
That's what I'm
do their job. Mitch, I know you're just chomping at the bit there, as I'm sure Mark is, who's sitting on the edge of his seat and almost in the aisle. Joe, you look very relaxed. Murray, you look relaxed, but you're always uptight. So I know that the attorneys all have something to say.
Then all of a sudden it got lost. And there are buildings that have magnificent interiors and magnificent exteriors, but they may not have a courtyard that is visible, and so therefore that doesn't meet the technical requirement of character contributing, and they still should be considered by staff.
I think we're all in agreement with that.
We have 9 buildings
We were talking about
before
health
us.
and
We don't have the
safety
whole
issues.
city. They're specific
There
buildings.
was a comment that was not going to be the case. That's
No,
my point.
that wasn't.
No, not at all.
We didn't-
Okay, Mark, I have to give you a minute. Murray, of course I'll give you a minute. But will you take only a minute? That's the question. Okay.
Once again, Happy New Year. It's a pleasure to be here, even at this hour. First of all, I do not represent any of the 9 applicants. I do not represent any developer on this ordinance.
Then why am I letting you speak?
Because I voted once in 8 years on the initial vote for an emergency ordinance, and that's what got this whole thing started.
Okay.
I also did appear before the Planning Commission to give them my view, not as a representative of any client. I think I take a little bit different view, and I think the approach I take may allow Councilman and Vice Mayor Webb to get back into the game. I view the issue as to whether common interest developments, once they are a common interest development, should be treated differently or reviewed differently by the council. I argued before the Planning Commission, and I want to congratulate them for all of their hard work and congratulate staff for all of its hard work, the position that there should be no differences in criteria between a condominium and a stock cooperative. If you have a minimum level of security in one, you should have the same level of security in the other. If you have parking requirements in one, you should have the same parking requirements in the other. And that's exactly what this ordinance does, and I congratulate the Planning Commission and staff. We do have a situation, be it from a loophole, be it from application of the law as it exists, which is what, by the way, attorneys do when I draft estate plans. I try to take advantage of the tax laws to the benefit of my client. We have a situation where the City Council, as a governing board, has a very clear interest in governing the transition of residential rental housing to ownership housing, because that takes off the market rental housing and affects this city. And that is what you have done by applying limitations and criteria before there can be a conversion. As I understand it tonight, the 9 units we are talking about have been converted. They are stock cooperatives. They are no longer rental units. They are off the market just as a condominium is off the market, and they are sole ownership units just as condominiums are sole ownership units. So my question then is to the council, if the reason for regulation, i.e. the preservation of rental housing and the governing of the rules of conversion if you're going to allow it, is moot because it's already been done, does the city have a legitimate governmental interest to prevent a change in form among a common interest development that already exists? As a practical matter, it is unlikely in the near future that condominiums will wish to convert to stock cooperatives. However, it can happen. And it is my belief that whatever minimum criteria you set on standards should be applicable to existing condominiums, and there are condominiums in the city that have 0 parking. I converted them. I can give you the street addresses. You should set minimum standards across the board for existing condominiums and existing stock cooperatives and any other form of common interest development. Other than that, you should leave it up to the individual ownership of the building which form they should choose. I believe that if you adopt that approach, since it is a general law application, that Vice Mayor Webb would not be excluded from participating in the ordinance. And I, of course, look to the city attorney for that determination at 11:15. I thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's always a pleasure to hear from you and your sage wisdom.
They are wise words, as always, from former Mayor Egerman. I do think that there are still legitimate public legitimate public reasons and a legitimate public interest in beyond simply the preservation of the rental housing stock for the regulations that have been set forth, including some of the items that have been discussed tonight, which involve the upgrade of the units and whether or not to allow a conversion even between forms of common interest development without seeing some upgrade of those units. Now, whether or not that's a sufficient reason to require us going through that process is of course, a decision for the City Council. I think former Mayor Egerman makes a very persuasive argument, but I don't want to concede the point that there is no legitimate interest in seeing the upgrade of these units, even in the instance when they change simply from one form of common interest development to another. I do think that there are interests that can be furthered there. With regard to the conflict of interest question, I think that given the narrow application, the narrow practical application of the amendment, at least as I understand it and as it's still being discussed tonight, at this point in the evening, without giving it further thought, I would still advise against Councilmember Webb participating in the consideration of this amendment, because it does seem to have, at least as a practical matter, still application only truly to 9 units, since we're not going to see the existing large number of condominium units, as we've heard, apply for conversions to stock cooperatives or community apartment projects.
Okay, before I let former Mayor Tillum and Mr. Fisher speak, I think it's extremely important for this council to know in every one of these buildings what the difference is between what they can satisfy versus what anyone else would need to for a conversion. So we need to know what pieces are missing from these buildings, and we have to see it for everyone. We have to know what is there and what isn't there, because Mark makes a very good point, and I actually thought that they did have to equalize, that it didn't matter. And they are getting something extra. And what's the worst that can happen if we say no? They will remain stock cooperatives. they will remain common interest developments. They will still be ownership units, and I accept the financing argument, but it isn't compelling enough to me to want to sacrifice things that we are requiring from other people in the interim. And again, the loophole was they got the common interest development. So I would recommend that until we see a matrix of what every unit in every building can satisfy, I couldn't vote on it. I want to know how the rest of you feel about that.
That's basically what I asked, that we get a finding of the staff on each unit, of what the status is on each unit, how many parking, how much upgrade they've done, what is the health and security issues and all that, forgetting about issues that they cannot deal with at all, the setbacks, something like that, that they cannot move the
Well,
building.
I
If
don't-
it's practical.
I
no,
don't, I
wanna
don't go
know.
there. I don't agree.
Well, then they let you, well, they can say there is no setback. It's okay. Then I will decide on that.
Right,
But
I
that-
think that that's the way
It's
to
fine,
approach
it's fine. All I want to do is find out what is, as you said, what is the difference between that and a condo would be. And then we can choose and say out of these 9, maybe 5 or 6 or 10 or 4 apply and the others don't.
Frank, do you have any comments about that?
Go back to what I said before. Planning
Okay.
Commission said 2 out of the 9, they probably wouldn't approve today, and I'm willing to go with the other 7.
Barry?
Well, I agree with Frank. I would be willing to go with the other 7 as well. But I don't see a downside to what Jimmy is proposing at all. You know, if we create this matrix, indeed, some will not be able to satisfy a certain element, but then let's let the council decide, you know, how they meet the threshold. I have a feeling 7 of the 9 will probably clearly meet the
If
threshold,
they do, it will be great.
and then it'll be easy.
Frank,
Okay.
if we give it back to the commission, they have their own criteria. I don't know what criteria they would use to say that 2 don't meet. I want to know what those criteria are. I want the staff to
Well,
tell me that these,
All I'm saying is, we've been here all night long discussing this, and we're just guessing at what's going on here, because the
that's what we're
Planning
asking
Commission
for.
That's why we're
hasn't.
asked- That's why
So
we're
we
asking.
need to know that information.
Yep,
Yes,
we need to
that's
get
why
the
we're asking
facts.
for
I don't
it.
wanna
So
throw it
we're-
back
that's
to
why
the
we're not going to
commission.
vote before we have that. Okay, we have 3 people for that. Okay, you all have been very patient. I know we promised Mr. Tillum and Mr. Fisher that they're going to speak, but since I've bypassed everybody in the audience who has been so patient, is there anyone out there who wants to add something to this, or do you want to come next time and give us your comments? Is there any of you that want to speak? I see your hand back there, Brian. Okay. Why don't you just line up behind one another? That way I won't need to call your names. Hopefully you'll say something different than those, but you've been very patient, so please come on up. Just line up behind one another. Thank you for your patience.
Patience is not a problem.
time off.
The only thing I feel is very important to express tonight, because I was told from previous talks, you know, that people don't necessarily like the way our building looks from the outside on Crescent Drive, but that's exactly the point. And the point is, we have, I think, in my opinion, one of the most superior locations. It's north of Wilshire. I think it's the only one that was converted that's north of Wilshire. And if you don't like the way it looks, that's exactly the point. We've submitted plans last month to the planning department, very extensive plans, which we volunteered. We're one of the few, I think we were the only building out of the 9 buildings that didn't even ask for any exemptions in terms of allowing, it didn't even need, it was no discretion involved in the decision-making to approve our particular building. Yet nevertheless, we volunteered an extensive amount of remodeling, life safety upgrades, disability upgrades, or we're going to make 2 units completely ADA compliant, ramps and handrails, and life safety features, plus a tremendous amount of upgrading cosmetically inside and out, which we've already submitted, and it's being very scrutinizingly analyzed.
Okay, well,
And
I'm
I think
sure-
based on these grounds, plus we have the highest parking ratio compared to anybody else, I mean, how do you define a character building? What's the point of this kind of discrimination? It's completely unnecessary. We're talking about a limited amount of possible damage. any of the tenants that opposed our project in the hearing mainly did so because they didn't understand a co-op. That doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It's the perception we're talking about here. And in terms of perception, they told me, including the most active opposed person, I don't know if I should mention her name. If you want, I'll tell you her name on the record. But she said openly she would consider to buy it if it was condo, but not if it's a co-op. So why penalize these tenants who've been living there and would buy a condo because they're afraid of the stigma that comes with co-ops and the limited amount of versatility? Why penalize these people just because there was some kind of a loophole? And where's the logic there? I didn't hear any arguments that made any sense to that regard.
Okay, and would you state your name just for the record?
Brian Nissel.
Thank you, Brian, very much. And will you state your name, please, everyone, before you speak?
My name is Tom Gottfredson, and I'm with the owners of 137 South Roxbury, which is a building that has been approved as a co-op. We've heard the word loophole used quite a bit tonight, and I would like to point out that it was not an automatic layup for the approvals of anybody who happened to get an application in. A number of buildings were turned down. In our case, we were required to reduce the number of units to match the number of parking spaces. We had an 8-unit building. We were required to reduce the number of units to 6 and also engage in a number of life safety items, fire and the like, rewiring, replumbing. So to say it was a loophole, we felt we went through a process. I would also point out that there doesn't appear to be any standards that I can understand that you're going to be applying when you consider the 9 buildings. The ordinance that's under consideration is just that, it's under consideration. So that isn't a document that's written in stone and that can be applied uniformly. Rather, I'm hearing a number of ideas being floated out. I don't see a standard that you're going to be applying when you consider which of the 9 buildings are approved and which are not. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Robbie Koch. I'm a resident of 148 South Peck, which is one of Mr. Conheim's buildings. And a lot of the residents have gone home tonight, so I felt I should speak to say what we all wanted to say to come here tonight. From my perspective, which is a buyer's perspective, a condominium is much more attractive than a cooperative for 3 reasons: ownership, financing, and flexibility. In terms of ownership, as everybody knows, with a condominium, you actually hold a piece of real estate rather than just stock in a corporation that owns the housing. To me, that's much more attractive as an investment. In terms of financing, with a cooperative, many of them only have a single financier which you can go to, which may give higher interest rates, force you to put down a larger down payment, which limits the availability of purchasing because you only have limited options. Third, in terms of flexibility, when you have a cooperative, you have a board that can limit what you do with your apartment, who you might be able to sell it to, the number of occupants, whether you have a pet, all those kind of things that are not set when you have a condominium. So that's my perspective and a lot of the other people who live in these buildings, our perspective and why we would rather have a condominium, and it's a more attractive purchase. Thanks.
Thank you, Robbie.
Is that your dad?
Hi,
No.
my name is Brooke Kaufman,
Hi, Brooke.
and I'm at 9601 Charleville. I will not restate what the fine gentleman said before me, but I concur wholeheartedly. One thing I want to add is the state, I've lived in that building for 3-4 years now, and I've seen what Mr. Conheim has done. He's painstakingly restored it, been there, put a lot of time and energy into it, and as a young woman and a businesswoman who is happy to live and work in Beverly Hills, it's a fine option for me to go into a condo. I don't have the resources at this time to go buy a $4 or $5 million house in Beverly Hills, but I certainly work hard, and I think that having a condominium available to me, and a beautiful one at that, in the locale in Beverly Hills where I want to stay, is very important.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, council members, honorable mayor. My name is Lorenzo Lamas, and I'm a resident of Beverly Hills. I have an interest in at least one of the 9 properties that we've been discussing tonight. But I did want to mention something that's very important to me, and that is mainly that as a condominium owner versus a co-op owner, I'm owning 100% of my property versus a percentage of a building, which is, as I understand it, in a stock co-op. This is much more appealing to me, and I think it would be much more appealing to the next buyer that would be interested in purchasing my property. So I prefer to own 100% of my property than a percentage of a building. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
My name is Jeffrey Miller, and I'm currently renting. I live in the area, and I'm looking to buy soon. I'm a dentist. I graduated a couple years ago, and I'm just opening up a practice in the Beverly Hills Triangle. And so, in the very near future, I hope to be able to buy a house. I don't think would be reasonable, but hopefully a condo. And I know I'm a lot more interested in buying a condo, not very interested in buying a co-op. And one of the buildings happens to be that I heard about, and I am interested is the one on Crescent. That's one of them, but it makes sense, you know, as far as the down payment and financing and then reselling it and other kind of headaches. I certainly would prefer a condo.
Thank you very much. We want to let this gentleman speak.
I'm Jeffrey Whitehouse. I live at 9601 Charlieville. I was the one that was clapping loudly. I second Mr. Koch's flexibility, financing, and ownership. It's the only way to go. Condominium.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to start with Mr. Tillum, and then Mr. Fisher, and then Mr. Dawson.
Yeah, I think the tail end is the last group, and I have only 10 seconds. Thank you.
Okay, 10 seconds, Rudy.
Well, 10 seconds is exaggeration. One, I want to explain why I'm not opposing the giving them grandfathering status. If they took an advantage of a situation and didn't comply with condominium requirements. On the other hand, it's now, as Mark Eggerman said, part of the housing stock. It reduces the pressure on other buildings from being converted. Therefore, I'm not opposed to the grandfathering. I suggest you bring it back. One point about Mr. Delshout's comment about the notification process. What I was talking about was that the same notification was not made for this meeting as was made for the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission sent out thousands of notices. That was not done for this, and I suggest it should be. On the other hand, the Commission and staff have done an incredible job in bringing this forward and considering all kinds of criteria that we didn't have before. And I still commend the Council for making it happen and protecting both elements, the homeowner, the property owners and the renters of our city.
Yeah,
Last point, excuse me, Joe, the statistics the city are using needs to be revised. There are no longer 8,000 renters in the city. Part of those units are now, that they're talking about as part of rentals, are now condominiums. Part are set aside for other things like managers of buildings and so on. That is no longer a relevant number, and you really need some numbers, some accurate numbers to deal with in the future.
Thank you, Rudy. Joe?
I guess at 25 minutes to 12, the last thing you want to hear is from another person, another lawyer. And I'm here because Mitch asked me to come here. I've had some perspective in this thing. I was a president of a homeowners association on 211 Spalding, a condominium. And, the last thing the city needs is to have the staff